1 of this video presentation gave you a quick overview of what reflection is. The second part of the video presentation introduces a few tried and true reflection methods. Remember, reflection is the intentional consideration of an experience in light of instructional objectives. And remember, reflection is conducted before, during, and after service. So, let's get started. Many of the methods we're going to show you here today are adaptations based on methods described by Janet Eiler, Dwight Giles, and Angela Schmeide. Oh, and one more thing. While reflection is a critical part of service learning, it can be used in any type of course, as the examples shown here will illustrate. The first one is pre-flection, and it's a powerful and simple technique grounded in constructivist learning theory. It activates learners' existing knowledge and experience. Here's a couple of ways that it can be used. Especially at the beginning of a course, class, or project. Students write down on an index card what they think they're going to learn, what they want to learn, what they're excited or anxious about. The instructor collects and keeps and then redistributes these cards at the end of the course to reflect on and see how much growth has taken place. Here's some other ways that you can use pre-flection. Have students write down their thoughts or definitions of a key concept to be covered in class or a service experience. Circulate the definitions and talk about them. Or you could put them in a pile and randomly select and then share anonymously. Students can pair up and share their definitions, or they could discuss the experience of their pre-flection discussions as a large group or later in journals. When students do pre-flection, they often discover new perspectives and thoughts and ideas that they never thought about before. Conversely, pre-flection also reveals that others have similar understandings of the concept or terms. This gives the instructor a lot of insight about their anticipation and anxieties about the learning and service experience. When you revisit the pre-flection at the end of the class or the course or project, students and the instructor really can see growth. Here are a couple of examples. Prior to a week-long service trip in post-Katrina New Orleans, students were asked to jot down one thing they were excited about and one thing they were a bit nervous or apprehensive about. The cards were put into a pile and each student randomly pulled a card and read it aloud. This public yet anonymous discussion revealed shared excitement and fears, such as the fear of using power tools, and this provided the instructor a great deal of insight for planning the service work. In another example, prior to a class session on the topic of sustainability, students were asked to write down their definition of the term. They exchanged cards which revealed shared and divergent understanding of the concept. But after the class discussion, students revisited their definitions and reflected on their new understanding and insight. This also served as baseline information to chart the students' growth. Graffiti is another method that is public yet anonymous, where students can respond to a topic. It's usually effective with a two-sided issue, but it doesn't have to be used this way. Poster paper is spread around the room on the walls or tables. Individuals or small groups of students rotate and respond to the topic by writing on the poster paper. Here's an example using the term sustainability. The instructors put poster paper around the room and students are asked to reflect and respond and write down the advantages and disadvantages of hydrogen power cells, as well as advantages and disadvantages of solar power. A variation on this technique might be having the students respond from different perspectives. For instance, responding as if they were the chairman of an oil company or a environmental advocacy group representative. Here's another example. Class, we've discussed cultural differences in oral and nonverbal communication in class. On the graffiti paper around the room, I'd like you to jot down specific examples of oral communication patterns on one sheet, and on the second sheet, list examples of body language behaviors you've observed during your service learning project with the Native Americans we've been working with on the reservation. On the third sheet of graffiti paper, express how this made you feel or how you responded. Here's some things to consider when you're using graffiti. It can be simply listing ideas or examples, perhaps even feelings, without necessarily listing pros or cons. It can also be responding to a thought or a quote or an experience such as the service project. This provides a safer venue for shy students to be actively engaged in a reflection activity, and the ideas generated in class can be addressed in more detail outside of class in journal entries to be turned in the next day. Now let's look at the ABCs method. This is basically a method that can be used in oral or written reflection, like in journals or the graffiti method we just looked at. It's basically a framework for reflection, and it also provides a way of assessing and scoring and providing feedback. A stands for affect. Students are invited to reflect on their attitudes, emotions, and feelings. B stands for behavior. Students reflect on their past behavior, current behavior, or predict future behaviors. C stands for cognitive connections to class content. Students are invited to reflect on and make overt references to topics and terms and skills discussed in class. Here's an example. As a class, we have studied group dynamics, and your service project has required you to work in teams. What have you been feeling during the process, and why? How did you behave during the process? Can you think of a time you had to work with another group in a similar situation? What did you do? And with this new insight, how might you behave differently in the future based on this experience? And what concepts or terms from class readings reflect this dynamic you've reflected on? Now, there's two things to consider. First, there's no right or wrong answer when expressing feelings. Students are never penalized for articulating negative feelings, but they must articulate what they're feeling and why. And some students are uncomfortable with this because this is something new to them. Second, when you're doing the C component of the ABCs, students really must make an overt connection to the content from class. That way, the instructor can see what they've been learning or not learning. Here are some possible ways to assess and score the ABCs. One easy way is to simply use a dichotomous scoring procedure of awarding a single point for articulating affect, a point for articulating behavior, and a point for articulating cognition, for a total of 3 points. Now, another way is to have a qualitative range for each of the ABCs, and a score of 1 is for a marginal mention in any of the ABCs, whereas a score of 2 is given for a little bit more information, while 3 points are awarded for a comprehensive or rich discussion. So in this way, there are 9 points possible, 3 points for each of the ABCs. Now, feedback. Scores for reflection is probably a new experience for students, and their first attempts are likely to be a bit shaky. So an instructor might allow the first attempt as a freebie, but provide considerable feedback on why the student didn't earn all the points. Here's an example. Say a student articulated how they felt and even described past behavior and predicted future behavior, but they did not make any overt connections to class content, which is the C in the ABCs. Point this out to the student. Give them an opportunity, with a timeline and deadline, to rewrite and resubmit their reflection entry that includes the cognitive connections, so they learn what you expect from them and how the ABCs work. Let's look at the next method, which is called What, So What, Now What, and came out of the Campus Outreach Opportunity League, or C.O.O.L, back in the 1980s. The what is a topic or issue that is identified, defined, and discussed. So what is the rationale or importance of that topic and issue. And the now what allows students to reflect on what are the next steps to take. The cool thing about this method is that it can be used in a class discussion as a large group, as a small group, or in dyads, as a pre-flection activity, as a graffiti activity, or as a written journal activity. Here's an example using sustainability again. The word sustainability is the what. It's the term discussed in class projects and in the reading assignments. Students are asked to reflect on examples in their personal lives and their service learning experience. But in the process, students discovered and reported there's little evidence of sustainability in their personal lives or at their service sites. So it moves to the next step of so what? Why does this matter, if at all? Why should we care in terms of policy, lifestyle, the environmental impact, health matters, economic impact? Students could be put into small groups to brainstorm and then reconvene for a large group discussion. Students might go outside of class and do written reflection to discuss and turn in the next day. Finally, the students reflect on now what. This could mean small group discussion on new policies or how to challenge cultural norms, to come up with strategies to promote sustainability, and even possible application to their personal lives or the service learning experience. Here's an example from a social work class where the instructor simply made 3 columns on the whiteboard in front of the classroom and every day introduced a new topic. In this case, the what is the new Medicare policy for senior citizens. And he invited his social work students to reflect on the so what, why does this matter, and now what are they going to do with this information and insight when they make their next site visit with their clients. Take a stand is another reflection method. The instructor has to prepare provocative questions or statements without right or wrong answers. The instructor then poses the question, and students respond by standing up if they agree with the statement to take a stand. The instructor will facilitate a dialogue on why someone is taking a stand. They have to explain their position, and then turning to someone who is sitting and inviting them to respond and explain why they are sitting. Well, here's an example. Should students be required to do service outside of class to graduate? Well, some students will stand, others will remain seated. But a rich exchange of ideas is bound to take place if students back up their ideas and the instructor facilitates the discussion. Here's some other things to think about when doing Take a Stand. You could adapt or modify the response format with a Likert type range of response using the room, with one side of the room being strongly agree and the other side strongly disagree, and students stand or place themselves in the room on a continuum of agreement or disagreement. Keep in mind, students may not know how to respond because they haven't thought about the issue before. And after a discussion, give students a chance to modify their stance. Consider listing the topic questions in advance so they can think about it. Always include the why in responses and discussion, and this promotes and teaches civil discourse. So, we hope you now see that reflection can be conducted in a variety of ways. It does not have to take up too much class time. In fact, it can occur outside of class, and reflection can enrich your students' learning experience. And these certainly are not the only methods, but they are tried and true. Most service learning centers conduct workshops on reflection where you can see and try out the ones shown here in this presentation as well as other methods. The key is to remember the important role reflection plays in service learning before, during, and after the service experience. But like anything new, it takes time to make it work for you and your students. Thanks for watching.